This is Chris Evans from Architecting IT, and I'm here today with Matt Watts, Chief Evangelist at NetApp. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm doing very well, Chris. Good to be able to talk to you today.
Okay, so why don't you just spend a second and tell everybody what you do for NetApp in terms of being a Chief Evangelist?
Yeah, so it's a slightly unusual title, but I guess I have two main areas of responsibility. The first one is that kind of outbound, changing the perception of who NetApp are. I think a lot of people still see NetApp as the NAS, the storage, the filer company, maybe, and we're so much more than that. So a big part of what I do is really changing that perception. And then the other part of it is really being more of a feedback into our corporate teams, looking for those trends, those strategies that we need to be involved with, we need to be thinking about in terms of how we help our customers going forward.
Right, let's get into the conversation for today. So, Matt, it's probably a good idea to set the scene before we go further into our discussion to understand what we mean by both hybrid and multi-cloud. So, let me give you my definition and how I see it. In terms of hybrid cloud, I see that as being the use of more than one cloud between on-premises and the public cloud. So, for example, you might have data running on your local on-site environment, and you might decide to move some of that to the cloud in order to use some cloud functionality. So you're using a hybrid of the two. It's pretty similar if you imagine, say, the example of, say, a hybrid car, where sometimes you might be on the battery, sometimes you might be on the engine, but in general you use the two together rather than separately. Now, a multi-cloud I see as being the use of many clouds, and that doesn't necessarily mean you have to use them together. It could mean you use just on premises, you might use one public cloud, two public clouds, but crucially, you're using both SaaS and IaaS because all of these are public cloud services. So how does NetApp see that, Matt, in terms of the way that you define the hybrid multi-cloud strategy?
So I think the definition you've given is very consistent with what we think, actually, Chris. I think in terms of hybrid, I always think about it as it's that sort of augmentation. It's, how do I take what we currently do in, let's say, a private cloud model, and how do I augment that with the capabilities of the public cloud? And that can be, test development, disaster recovery, tiering, or analytics, moving data to the cloud to do some tests or some analytics work against it. So I think that's kind of hybrid, it's augmented. Whereas I think multi-cloud, what we're increasingly seeing now is that people want to take advantage of the strengths that different cloud providers offer. So I might want to take an application or data into one cloud because I want to do some AI or ML against it. I might want to take it to another cloud to do some analytical work against it. So it's that multi-cloud is much more that freedom of tapping into the clouds and the different strengths of those clouds, to be able to take advantage of what they can do.
Perfect. Now, obviously, if you're developing a strategy around hybrid and multi, there are many, many steps that you go through in terms of that evolution. Both you and I have a diagram which, funny enough, looks remarkably similar. And what we'll do is we'll put a link on at the bottom of the screen here so people can have a look at both of those and see what they are and help them understand their strategy. But for now, I think that helps us understand where we're going to head in the rest of our discussion. So I'd like to talk about technology, Matt, and how that works with hybrid and on-premises cloud. This is an interesting area because obviously, most people focus on the technology side of things. And in terms of implementation, I think certainly from NetApp's perspective, we've seen two models. There's the sort of CVO model and there's the CVS model, and they're slightly different. There's good reasons between why those particular models are actually being chosen. Can you just take us through the two different models and what the differences are between the two of them?
Yeah, sure. So it's kind of third party and first party. So what we see a lot of different use cases for cloud, and I think one of the ones is that people are just looking at, I've got an enterprise application, and behind that is a reference architecture where we've certified all kind of elements within the stack, the operating system level, the storage operating system level, but I want to be able to take that to the cloud for test development, or even just actually we want to run that as a SaaS platform now and deliver that to our users. And that's, I think, where CVO comes in, because with CVO it's a virtual version of ONTAP running inside the cloud where you have that control over exactly what release it is that you want to be able to use. So you retain a level of kind of infrastructure as a service, that level of control in the cloud. Whereas CVS, which is actually, it has several versions depending on which cloud. FSx for ONTAP in Amazon, ANF, which is for Azure. In that case, you just want a volume. You don't care about all of the physical attributes of the technology that sits behind it. You just want a volume with a capacity, a level of performance, of protection, so, and that's a first party service, which again, we're seeing a lot of appeal for, because there's a lot of times when people go to the cloud and they want to use the native first party services inside those clouds, particularly for data, which is persistent and potentially is going to be in that cloud for a long, long time into the future.
So I think the idea of separating the two is important. So let's put CVO to one side, because I think we can sort of see the use cases for that. And let's talk about the sort of CVS type model, the integration directly within the cloud. Now, there aren't any other vendors who are natively integrated into the cloud the way that NetApp are. And I think there's a lot of benefits for that. So for instance, I see that I'm offloading all of the issues around maintenance, upgrades, patching to you as a vendor. Now that, okay, great, wonderful. It saves me a lot of work. But actually there's more than that, because it means now that you as the vendor can innovate. You can bring new features to the solution. I don't have to take an upgrade to do that. I just get an email that says, yeah, that feature's now available to me on this platform. So there's an opportunity for you to innovate and for me to offload a lot of the sort of mundane tasks, perhaps, that I would have done if I was a storage administrator.
Yeah, exactly that, Chris. And that's the cloud model, isn't it? It's exactly what you've said. A reason people went to Office 365 or Microsoft 365, there was lots of reasons, but one of them is I've always got the latest. Whenever there's a new feature, a new capability, a new level of security, it's there. It's instantly available. It's instantly applied. We're instantly using it. And that's I think what people are looking for from storage in the cloud as well. In most cases, is I just want to store the data, but if there are new features and new capabilities, then I don't want to have to plan for when do we upgrade that, when do we make that available. That is the cloud model. It's just as new things become available, enhancements, security, whatever, I just want that to be readily available to me for when I'm ready to be able to adopt it. But I don't want to have to go through the step of, we need to upgrade the storage.
I think it sort of passes back a lot of the responsibility that we would have done as storage administrators. For instance, we would have looked at things like performance. We would have looked at trying to find those corner cases where things weren't quite working the right way. And you'd spend hours and hours and hours of time. They become real sinks to you that you'd never get back. And certainly a lot of the time you'd possibly never find the answer to, because it was just a transient issue related to an application. So there's a huge amount of overhead that it really eliminates, and it allows the storage administrator to go off and do something much more useful. But from a customer perspective, I think there's a massive benefit here. And that's, as a user of something that's natively integrated into, say, an Amazon platform, I can now use native storage security features. I can now integrate with other applications. I can look at AI. I can really sort of use this technology more natively with the features that are available on the cloud.
Yeah, exactly, Chris. And one of the things is, once you have a kind of a shared storage platform in the cloud, whether that's FSx or whether that's ANF, it means you can then expose that data to any application that you want to be able to use to be able to innovate and kind of create value from it. That's interesting for me. It's the kind of the evolution of the storage administrator, which is, we need to release some tasks, the kind of the upgrades, those kind of things that we've typically done on premises. We need to let go of that, because actually our role is how do we use the services that we're now kind of developing and building to create enhanced value for the people that are going to consume them.
Yeah, so if I was a modern storage administrator, I think I'd be looking and saying to customers, not tell me what you want and I'll deliver it to you. I'd be looking at it and saying, well, actually, tell me what your requirements are now from a technical perspective, and I'll tell you how you can best use a combination of what we can offer you on premises or the cloud. So rather than actually saying, yeah, I'm afraid the only thing I've got in my bag to give you today is storage sitting in the data center, I can actually look at it and say, well, actually, no, we can do a lot more for you than that. We can give you something that might be more flexible around cost, around deployment, around services. And so now you're building out a portfolio of services that encompass both on-premises and cloud. And your value to the business becomes much more useful than just that gatekeeper around delivering some technology.
Yeah, and that's sort of it's an interesting part to the discussion, isn't it, Chris? Is that you're now sort of going to say, well, what do you need? And now is I can make the decision as to do that. Do we do that within our own data center using the technologies that are available? Do we make it a more kind of augmented hybrid model? Because actually, some of the things you're telling me are short-term requirements. So let's burst out to the cloud to be able to do those things, or should you actually do this cloud natively? And I think having a consistent storage plane that sits underneath all of that means it's very easy to make that decision and know that the values that the storage offers, which it does, snapshots and snap restore and cloning and all of those things, it can offer those regardless of what model it is that you choose to put behind the application that you're looking to deploy.
Yeah, so this isn't just about saying we've just got some different technology. This is about use cases, this is about applicability, this is about how you actually use the technology in your business. And I think that whole side of it is a much more interesting discussion, as well as the things we've already discussed. The ability to offload a lot of those mundane tasks and allow the vendor to iterate. So I think people shouldn't just look at this and think, well, okay, you're giving me something I don't know how to use or I don't really want, because it can be fully integrated with your existing processes, and you can use it just like you use your storage today. What the storage administrator is giving you is choice, and ultimately, as an end user, as a business, having choice means you can be more flexible with the way you work. So I really like the idea that the hybrid model can really be positive from a technology side of things.
Yeah, completely agree, Chris.
So let's talk about supply chain. Now, it's very interesting to see that in the last couple of years, due to the pandemic and other issues, we've had a real issue with chip supply, and that's affected everybody across the industry. It's not just technology suppliers like NetApp or any of the others. It's affected the motor industry, and to the extent that we're seeing certain vendors pulling features on their cars even as they roll them out. So inevitably, every few years we see some sort of supply chain issue. We had one last year with NAND, where we saw NAND flash got contaminated, and we've had a real constriction of supply, and that probably will push costs up. 10 years ago, we saw the floods in Thailand, where we saw a shortage on hard drives. So supply chain is always a problem that we have to manage. The question is, how do we do it in a hybrid world? And I think, Matt, when you've got the choice to choose whether you deploy on premises or in the cloud, you've got the ability there to mitigate some of those supply chain issues.
So exactly that, and I think there's so many reasons why people go to the cloud, and I think the history that you've just shared around kind of supply chain. I think that's just an indication of what we're going to see in the future. There are just more and more and more companies all fighting over the same components, and the minute we see constraints in supply, it affects everybody. So I think going forward, all companies are going to have to be thinking about, when we're looking to deploy a new project, what are the timeframes going to be? What is the risk to the project of there being some other supply chain constraint or supply chain issue? And that's why I think, again, another reason why people will start to consider the cloud more and more and more, because the cloud gives you that, I don't want to say limitless, but in terms of most organization, it would appear to be an almost limitless, instantaneous pool of resource that they can draw from. So, supply chain will be part of people's considerations. People will still need on-premises technology, but I think increasingly people are going to look to the cloud and say, actually, is the cloud a way of us just removing the supply chain as one of those variables that is often something that's out of our control?
Yeah, I know that when I was an end user, when I was an administrator, we would work a lot with the business. We'd develop plans around how we were going to use storage to deliver to new projects that were coming along. And as a result, when you knew there's going to be a constraint or there was going to be issues, well, you did the most obvious thing, you overbought. So you end up buying more technology, so you've got some in reserve, and then you spent more money, and you've got technology you're not using, sitting on the floor, not being consumed. And funny enough, there's a lot of times when the business wouldn't actually project properly. They'd either say, we don't need it, or they'd come to us and say, we need it tomorrow. Now, in those days, if I could have said, well, let's build a hybrid solution here that says, sometimes you'll take on-prem, sometimes you'll take stuff from the cloud, I'd have been in a much stronger position to manage and mitigate some of those risks. And I think now, when we look at the challenges around supply chain, actually, if you are in that position where you think that your vendor might say, well, I can't guarantee I can deliver, in the timescales promised, there's a real opportunity here to say, if I've developed a cloud strategy that involves hybrid and public cloud, I can actually just use that. And that's my alternative, and that's my mitigation strategy.
Yeah, and I completely agree, Chris. And I think where we are at the moment is, I think all companies, if you are currently impacted by supply chain constraints, hopefully we'll get through that, and things will start to ease up again. But if you are currently impacted, isn't now maybe the chance to say, actually, let's look at the cloud. Let's take that variable out, which is affecting lead times and delivery times, and let's look at, could we deploy this application into the cloud? And I think from NetApp's point of view, it all goes back to, why did we make ONTAP available inside the cloud providers? For many, many different reasons. But I think now it also is one of those, the benefits of it is, if you need ONTAP, then do you need it on premises where you could be affected by current or future supply chain constraints, or do you need it in the cloud where you take that variable out?
Yeah, I think of it as time to value. So, and this, which is a terrible expression in some respects. It sounds like a real marketing term, but actually, I think it really is a genuine expression of where we are. So, for example, if I'm deploying technology on premises, if I have to go out and buy, my lead times tend to be measured in days and weeks. If I want to consume storage that's in the cloud, my lead time is minutes. So now, I know I can just go and I grab a resource from the cloud, deploy it, and I'm going. And it's a combination of the two, and whichever works best for you. But there is a real time to value here that you can actually build into your design and everything else that you're doing in terms of how you deploy storage in your environment. So I really think we shouldn't think of the supply chain here as an issue. We should just think of it as part of the overall deployment of technology. And as you said, it's a choice. It becomes down to the best way you want to deliver your technology for you.
And I think, to add one final point to what you've just said, Chris, the wonderful thing about cloud is, when you don't need it anymore, you can give it back.
Yes.
And that if you're planning for on premises, you're buying for the peaks, you're buying for the longer term. Whereas in the cloud, you're buying for what you need now. And then when you don't need it anymore, you can release it. So, I think that's that other real value. It's the time to value, and the time to be able to release costs when you finish a project or you finish doing something that you've been working on.
Yeah, absolutely. So Matt, let's talk about business alignment. Now, this is quite an interesting topic, I think, because inevitably, when you look at the way that technology is deployed on premises and shipped to customers internally, there's very much a sort of a disconnect between perhaps what the business wants and the way that IT works. And I'll give an example of what I mean by that. So inevitably, IT buys hardware, technology, physical boxes, and so on, puts it on the floor, typically purchased through sort of capital purchases, although that model is changing to a certain degree. But the business wants to consume OpEx. The business wants to be able to consume gigabytes of capacity, and they want to be able to reference it in terms of things like performance and latency and so on. The sort of the metrics that relate to the application. Now, in a hybrid model, and when you're using the public cloud, we've got a much more, I think, a bigger opportunity here to align to what the business wants, because we're not having to do that conversion factor. So really, hybrid gives us an opportunity to really deliver some business alignment, I think.
Yeah, and this is something you and I have talked about before, Chris, and I think this is such an important thing, is that, how many years have we been going through chargeback and showback and all these really complex models? Because what we've been trying to do is make a capital investment, which typically comes from IT, and then somehow try and apportion how that's being consumed and used back out to the business. It's complex. It's moving money around. Whereas, I think you're absolutely right. When you think about the cloud, it's built for whoever wants to use it. If you've got a business unit that says, I need this amount of compute and storage resources because I've got a project to work on, knock yourself out. And it's then consumed and it's paid for by that particular business unit. So I think it helps to solve a lot of the complexities that we've seen in kind of terms of chargeback and showback, which I'm sure some people have got that right, but in my experience, That's been incredibly complicated.
I think you're right. I mean, I've tried to implement so many different chargeback models, and had a lot of pushback from chargeback. Showback tends to be more sort of acceptable to people, but when you talk about chargeback, it can be incredibly difficult to get people to agree that they've used the technology the way they have. You then get into arguments about how you bill. Do you do per day billing, per minute billing? It just becomes so complex, and it means that you have to build in models that take so much additional information from your infrastructure in order to do that. Now, it's much nicer to be able to say, well, if you're going to use a hybrid solution, all of that's going to be done for you. As long as you structure it correctly, you're going to get billing that really meets what the business wants. More appropriately, once you've used that technology, you're now not paying for it anymore. It's not like you've committed to that storage or whatever for a few years, and then when you don't want it, somebody else has got to find a usage for it. You finished using it, you pay, you give it back, and you're not paying anymore. It really, really sort of aligns with the business's financials, and I think performance and capacity is another one. Those metrics that people use when they're looking at what they want when they consume storage. The business doesn't want to know how you've implemented that. They just want to know that they've got an endpoint, they can consume it, and away they go.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that's really important, and again, it's an interesting point of discussion, is people sometimes look at the cloud, and I think we've moved away from the fact that the cloud is cheap, right? I think that people have realized that actually, in most cases, you do end up paying some form of a premium for the cloud, but it's because of exactly these things. It's you can go and consume the resources that you need to consume for a particular project, and maybe you would pay a little bit more per gigabyte or a little bit more per CPU cycle than you would if you'd procured the technology. But you can use what you want for as long as you want, and then when you don't want it anymore, you give it back. So it's much more on demand. So actually, people have to think differently about it. Isn't the cost per gigabyte? It isn't the cost per CPU. It's the cost over time of actually, if I'm aligning what I'm spending to the exact needs at that particular point in time, that typically is going to be substantially lower than making big capital investments into on-premises purchases where you're trying to cater for the peaks, and those don't occur that frequently.
Yeah, I think a good analogy there is the use of cars, transport. So, I could buy a car, I could drive everywhere personally. The cost of that car would come out as, as a certain amount every year, and I'd have to service it, I have to pay all those costs personally. Or I could go to a lease company when I only need a car for a week, pay for the lease cost. I'm pushing a lot of the charges in terms of management and everything to that company, but I'll pay a little bit more than I'd pay than I would if I bought that car outright. And then, of course, there's the super granular implementation where I use something like Uber or Lyft or a taxi company. I literally pay for the journey I want. When I finish that journey, I get out and I'm done. And I think what you've just described there is we're trying to transition towards that model where we've now got such a degree of flexibility, we only use the technology when we want. And ultimately, that's what businesses are going to want to do. So it's more about a term we've used before, time to value, and actually delivering the value more than you are delivering the physical technology.
Yeah, absolutely agreed, Chris. And again, bringing this back to kind of what is NetApp's role within all of this. I think maybe stretching your analogy a little bit too far, but if you're used to driving a BMW, then actually wouldn't you like to have a BMW when you use Uber? I mean, that's maybe a little bit too much of a stretch, but I think knowing that whatever you've been doing with the capital expenditures that you've making, the on-premises technology, actually you can have that in the cloud that looks and feels and behaves exactly the same way, but comes with all of those benefits that you've just described in terms of use it when you need it and release it when you don't.
Yeah, the business is getting a lot of other value as well. I mean, you're taking the human out of the provisioning process, for example. As you said, infinite capacity, so there's no need to be so far forward on planning. They need to do their internal cost planning, but they don't need to come to you with projections and things like that because it's just going to be there. So I think if you can align to the business, that's a powerful thing to do, and the hybrid cloud definitely lets you do that.
Yeah, agreed. And each business, as they look at the kind of the next innovation, knows exactly what the cost of the resources are going to be required that will enable them to achieve that innovation. So again, it's so much more aligned with this sort of much more dynamic business model that we're seeing.
Exactly. So we're going to talk about financial, Matt, now. And I think a lot of the other topics we've been talking about actually come down to finances. You know, finances is a big part of this. But I'd like to start by just talking about data center and the costs of building your own data center, deploying your own infrastructure, managing it, and so on. If we look at where we are today, energy costs are rising. People are much more focused on things like CO2 emissions. It's actually becoming a really irritating task to run your own data center, and the costs are escalating and obviously quite variable. So, using a hybrid strategy and pushing some of your data into the cloud allows you to mitigate, I think, some of the financial costs of building and managing your own infrastructure. And I think that's definitely becoming more important than it ever was.
So there are definitely kind of edge cases, right? There are companies where a data center or a new data center is going to be important for them because it just works for their business. But I'm going to say that in most that's an edge case. If I think about every company that I talk to, you know, from the largest of the large to the smallest of the small, whether it's a data center or a data cupboard, frequently what people are saying to me is we want out of this. These are big, expensive, you know, facilities that that you have to amortize over such a long period of time. So people are looking at that and quite rightly are saying, do we really want that? Because that sits on your books. You know,
Yeah.
that's a depreciating asset that you have to carry forward with you. So I think an awful lot of companies are now just looking at it and saying, when the costs are that high, either from an initial investment or just the kind of operating costs on an ongoing basis, most people that I talk to kind of want out of that business. I think data centers are not the luxury item that people aspire to have. I think they're one of those things that people really want someone else to worry about.
Yeah. I've been involved in building a few actually. Not physically. I mean, I didn't get out and put the bricks and the mortar down personally, but when it came to actually looking at the storage side and things like the infrastructure of cabling and fiber channel, a huge amount of work in deciding how to do it. And I've been involved in looking at data centers that have been in place for a long time, and it's amazing how out of whack they get. You end up with such a mess in them that a lot of vendors end up starting again and then trying to clear the mess up. So very quickly, you can end up in a real mess with data center planning, design, and costs escalate massively. So I'm not surprised to hear that people want to get out of the data center business. But that's one aspect of the financial side of things. The other side of that is we talked a little bit there about things like sustainability, and now people are focused on things like CO2 emissions. If you look at the public cloud providers, they're very much focused on generating green electricity now, low CO2. I think a lot of data centers are placed by places where they can get cheap electricity or generated by natural resources. So there's an ecological focus from the cloud providers to do the right thing as part of this.
There is, and I'm sure there'll be people listening to this that kind of think, oh, sustainability, that doesn't affect us. The reality is, it will. The entire world, because of climate change, COP26, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and even governments looking to do the right thing, are now starting to aggressively look at sustainability. And if you think about data centers, a couple of facts just to give you the context. Data centers currently consume between 1 and 2% of the world's electricity. On the kind of projections that we're seeing, by 2025, that could be upwards of 8, if not 10% of the world's electricity. And most of those data centers outside of the cloud providers who've done a great job of kind of getting to net zero or getting towards net zero, most of these data centers are big, energy consuming, CO2 generating assets. And so I think it'll be another reason why people will look at this, because we're seeing it in the supply chain. Dutch government requires a level of EcoVadis, and if you don't meet that EcoVadis rating with them, you can't do business with them. So I think data centers will come under the spotlight because they are such a significant amount of the energy consumption and the emissions that are created for small, medium, and large organizations.
Yeah, and ultimately, countries have got to decide how they're going to deal with the problem, and they are going to come back, I think, to companies and say you need to meet certain very, very strict standards, and at that point you're going to push that responsibility somewhere else if you can do it. I think within the hybrid side of things, though, there are many other aspects of the financial benefits. You're pushing people towards an OPEX model. If you're using a hybrid cloud, you're perhaps diverting costs away from buying infrastructure that you might not use because of other things like supply chain. So there's actually a big focus here that we could place on how you actually look at the financial cost of using a mixed hybrid and on-premises model. And I think if you're clever about it, if you're smart about it and understand your requirements from business, you've got the understanding about how you can go and best both mitigate some of those challenges around running data centers, but actually use the right technology at the right time. And, actually pushing people towards, say, for instance, consuming on-premises storage when they know it's a long-term project, but maybe somebody needs to do some sort of development and test and they just want to try something out. Much easier to push them into the cloud where they can give those resources back after a couple of weeks or months and really sort of cut down on their costs and really keep that tight.
Yeah, agreed. And again, thinking about the whole sort of sustainability side of this, when you look at the quantities of data that we're creating and how much of that is, it's about 10 to 15% of data center energy consumption is storage. So it's a pretty significant portion. So again, I think moving to the cloud, we know that all the forecasts say a lot more of the data will move to the cloud, because especially as data as it ages, why would we have that sitting in our data centers being powered, being fed, being watered, when actually we could move it into a cloud provider where we reduce a lot of the impact of that. And it's interesting you talk about costs. We are starting to see signs and indications that there could be environmental taxes. So that data center that's currently costing you X, now if we start to see environmental taxes coming in, what does X become when that starts to happen? So again, I think sustainability is a good thing to do, but I think it will also be a financially responsible thing to do as we look further into the future as well, Chris.
Yeah, so if you do it right, you save money, and if you do it right, you save the planet. Good reasons to do this all round, I think.
Two fantastic reasons, Chris.
Matt, let's talk about innovation. This is an interesting topic. So inevitably, anybody who's developing technology in their business starts by deploying something that is used to deliver a service. But ultimately, you want to get to a point where your business innovates, delivers new value to the business and to your customers, and that drives the bottom line, drives more revenue. Why else would we be in the business? I think if you're in the hybrid cloud, I think there's an opportunity to innovate here. And here's my sort of take on it and why I think this is the case. I think that if you've got the ability to start consuming different services in the cloud, many of which are produced really quickly, and vendors bring out all of these different new solutions that are using maybe AI or GPUs or all sorts of other sort of buzzword technology, you've now got the ability to try that stuff out. Go and have a go, see what you can come up with. Do some tests, see what works, see what doesn't, but you're not committing. You can use that, try it out, step away, do it again. So you've got the ability to iterate and to be much more creative than you would be, perhaps if you were doing things on premises.
Completely agree, Chris. This has always been the ultimate promise of cloud, and I think if we can help companies get data from kind of on premises where typically there is a more limited set of development and test applications available because it's more controlled. If you can get that data into the cloud, suddenly you expose that data to the entire kind of ecosystem inside Amazon or Microsoft or Google, and there are literally thousands of different applications. So for me, you're creating this wonderful kind of, as long as the data is secure and protected and everything else, you're then opening that up to this kind of wonderful playground of different technologies that people can use in lots of different ways to be able to look to see if there are ways of innovating around that data. So yeah, I think that's probably the most important part of the cloud, I think, is that innovation acceleration.
It's a step or two, though, to get there. I mean, you're looking at having to, I think, look at strategies around how you use hybrid and how you get, your infrastructure so that it's flexible enough that you can consume stuff that's on premises or in the cloud. and the end user, the business user doesn't have to really sort of think too much about where it's actually deployed. So I always see innovation as one of those things that is a sort of an end step after you've managed to put all the other things in place. And I think if you do, you really do have an opportunity to, to add value. You're right, there's so many different things you can choose from, but I think also if you've got the ability to be multi-cloud as well as hybrid, and that by that I mean if you've got a vendor who's got technology that sits in all of those clouds, because not everybody has certainly storage technology that deploys in all of the clouds, then you've got the ability to choose which one you want to go to for different features, because some of them are slightly different in my view. Some offer better features than others. So it is about using the cloud, but it's about using the best of the cloud at the right time for what you want to do.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about this as well, Chris, is that when you do go into the cloud, you're working with developers who really don't know what sits behind the stack that they're building. I just want an application and I need some storage for the data. And they're not necessarily thinking so much about the kind of the capabilities that different parts of that stack could offer. And a really good example I can give you, I met with a data scientist. He didn't know who NetApp were, and I quickly explained it. And he said, well, what could you do for me? Tell me it in that context. And I said, well, look, if you were using our storage in the cloud, I said I could create an instant replica of almost any quantity of training data such that you could train multiple AI algorithms in parallel. I said I could also take a snapshot of that data so that you have a history of exactly what data was used to train an algorithm at any particular point in time. And he said, Matt, that would fundamentally change my business. And it was kind of interesting that because he's the AI person, because he's looking at the frameworks that he wants to use to build the models, he's not necessarily looking at the stack that sits behind that or thinking about, if I make the right decisions further down the stack, how could that positively impact me in terms of kind of an acceleration of innovation?
Yeah, I think you've talked about an interesting fact there, Matt, and that's I look back at some of the stuff I've done over the years, and one of the things that I enjoyed doing was getting involved with the business and understanding what they were trying to achieve, because sometimes the technology we offered them might have been quite static and not really what they wanted. So now you're talking about how a business user might look at that and say, well, actually, this is what I'm trying to achieve. And if you can come to them with a solution that's much more flexible, gives them what they want, all of a sudden, they can be more creative and they come up with new ideas. And that's a great one that you've just given as an example. And I would hope that that's where we end up with the cloud and where we end up with hybrid, is that we see the benefit of using things on-prem, we see the benefit of using them in the cloud, but we iterate and we innovate around what is the best way to use both of those technologies in the way that we can.
Yeah, completely agree, Chris. And I'll add one final point is that I think this is the role, you and I have talked about this before, what's the role of the storage administrator going forward? And I think this is it. We're not saying that by going to the cloud, that role doesn't exist. We're just saying it changes. That what you've touched on is absolutely key. Suddenly you've got a lot more people who are doing and trying to innovate within the cloud, and you as the storage person or the data person, you need to get to those people because you need to help them to understand how your technology, your capabilities can have that incredibly positive impact on the environments they're building.
Yep, key message, Matt. Really good. Well, Matt, we've talked about 5 different areas. We've talked about the technical, we've talked about the supply chain, we talked about financial, we've talked about innovation, and we've talked about aligning with the business. 5 different areas here where hybrid, I believe, and having gone through it with you like we have, I believe really adds value to just using either on-premises storage or the cloud separately. I do think the hybrid model it's a 1 + 1 = 3. I know that doesn't make sense in terms of maths, but you're getting more than just the sum of the parts by using a hybrid model, I think. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I agree, Chris. And for the conversations that I have with all the people that I talk to, all the customers that I talk to and prospects, hybrid is without doubt the predominant kind of design philosophy that they're thinking about for all of the things that we just discussed. I think looking forward, all of the topics that we have just discussed are going to become more and more and more important. So, I'm completely with you. It's hybrid. I think is going to be the predominant model for the future, and it'll address so many of the challenges but create so many new opportunities as well.
Great. Matt, thanks for joining me. Really appreciate your time.
Absolute pleasure, Chris.